Okay, just putting all my finishing touches on. I've got the screen sharing working. Awesome. Okay, so we're going to wait a couple more minutes and we'll get started. So, American Gorilla, tell me what the last movie that y'all watched were. Did you watch The Godfather with your mom? She was telling me that they were talking about P2 in The Godfather, which kind of delves right into what we've been reading about Gladio. What? I also wanted to share, I was talking to a friend of mine that just spent quite a bit of time all over Europe um, doing research on World War II. And I was talking to him for a few minutes earlier and asked him if in all of his research he had ever heard of Operation Gladio. Interestingly enough, he had not. But when I asked him if he had heard of the werewolf units in Germany, he had. He was completely unaware, excuse me, that the Operation Gladio was the follow on to the werewolf units. And I found that incredibly interesting, which he just finished a year long master's degree program in Air War College, which I did as well several years ago. We're not going to say how many. And in theory, the war colleges is supposed to be teaching you about military history, history in general, conflict history, and looking all over the world at the previous military engagements and why they happened so that you could do proper analysis or put into context things that are happening today. And when you leave out something as fundamental as Operation Gladio, and when you start doing the research and you realize how much has been written about this, and none of it has ever been publicized in the United States. The as we're going to get into tonight, the operation to kill John Paul II was a Gladio operation, and it was all over the continent of Europe as a result. And I also want to put into context as we begin chapter 15, titled The Pope Must Die. It starts out the chapter with that famous quote from David Rockefeller saying, if you're accusing me of trying to create one world government, if that's the charge, I stand guilty and I'm proud of it. So these people are very open about what they're doing if you actually read what's going on. And now that I'm more attuned to what's going on, even the first sentence of chapter 15, by the end of March 1981, and we're talking about stuff going on in Italy. So the first thing that I did when I look at March 1981, I want to know who the ambassador for the US was at the time. Wolfgang's, yep. So I looked up in February of 1981, the ambassador was Richard Gardner. He was appointed in 77 and stayed till early 81. He's a Harvard graduate. He's a Yale graduate. He's a Rhodes Scholar, graduated from Oxford. And we know that everybody that is at Oxford on the Rhodes Scholar is part of the global elite, the international syndicate. That's a training ground for them. And after he left Italy, because keep in mind, everything that we've studied up until now, for the last 4 years, if you will, was under his watch. So the whole money laundering, the P2 involvement, the bank, Ambrosiano's collapse, it's all going on while he's the ambassador. And the ambassador is part of this whole CIA op. So he's out, and they bring in a guy by the name of Maxwell Robb. Now I'm going to share my screen, and I want y'all to look at this. Here's, excuse me, here's Maxwell Robb. Okay, this is the guy. Look at his face. That's nasty. Okay, so born in 1910, died in 2002. He's a lawyer. He was appointed by Reagan. Harvard graduate. Worked in the Senate, Navy. Look at this. Legal consultant to the U.S. Secretary of Navy, James Forrestal. And you may or may not know, James Forrestal, having been involved in all of this, he's, over the Navy intel. He knows all about what's going on. They commit him to a psych ward at a military hospital, and he suicided. Okay, this was a guy that was his legal counsel while he was in that job. So then he goes to the White House, and look at this. He's the U.S. delegation to UNESCO, which, a UN educational, scientific, and cultural organization. Bad, bad, bad. All right. And then if you look here, during his tenure as ambassador, he was accused by actor Nico Menardos as sanctioning on behalf of the U.S. government an arms deal with Iran during a meeting with the two of them at the embassy in Rome. At the time, Menardos was involved in business dealings with Saudi arms merchant Adnan Khashoggi, and that's the Khashoggi guy that got chopped up's dad. He was an international arms dealer. So this guy, the ambassador, denies his involvement and was not required to testify at the criminal indictment against Menardos and others, was dismissed by Rudy Giuliani in the wake of the Iran-Contra scandal. Is that crazy? That's crazy. So let's get back to I just wanted to share that. So I get that much information just by looking at the date of March 1981. So it puts into context everything that we're talking about, right? So you've got the guy that's the ambassador in Italy working out arms deals with Khashoggi's dad, an international arms dealer who usually worked on behalf of the Saudi Arabia. And when charges were brought for the arms deal, they're dropped by Rudy Giuliani. Crazy, crazy, crazy. Okay. So where we left off last time, we had the raid on Gelly, who is the Grand Poobah master, worshipful master of the P2 Masons. His villa has been raided. They get evidence of covert operations, bank statements linking P2, the Masonic order, that is all over the Vatican, even though that's against canon law, to right-wing terrorist outfits and criminal organizations such as the New Order, the Revolutionary Action Movement, and the Band of Magliana. So they confiscate files, and it also shows how close Gelli is to the CIA and Italy's intelligence agencies in this stash of information they grab. So, also, there was proof that Sedona, Calvi, and Marcinus were all members of the P2 secret society, the Masons. Now, and keep in mind, Calvi and Marcinus were the Vatican bankers, and Sedona was a Vatican banker even before them. So they were all instrumental in setting up the branches of Banco Ambrosiano in Latin America, and that's the bank they used for money laundering. Vatican shell companies had been used by P2 as a means of providing arms to right wing regimes and rebel armies. The Italian police are now aware that U.S. political leaders, including the Vice President Bush, Secretary of State, and U.S. Ambassador, were intricately involved in the inner workings of the P2 Lodge. John Paul II's failure to provide assistance to Sedona had led to the fake kidnapping of Sedona, the visit to Arezzo, and Sedona's incarceration in a New York prison where he now begins to talk. And there was a $100,000 contract put out by him while he's still in jail on John Kinney, who was his chief prosecutor during the extradition hearings. So they're building up to put all of the blame on John Paul II, because in the last chapter that we reviewed, John Paul II refused to get involved in helping Sedona. And we know that they did that all the time. People would escape, but for some reason, they were not going to help Sedona. John Paul II felt like if he did that, he would be acknowledging some obligation to pay back all the money that Sedona had embezzled. And by doing that, he would lessen the money that he can send to Poland to help fight the Polish workers striking against the Soviet Union, basically. So John Paul II digs his heels in because he's using part of this dark money that's been the ill-gotten gains for money laundering that's going on at the Vatican Bank to help Poland fight off the Soviet Union. So he doesn't want any of that jeopardized, so he leaves Sedona to rot in prison in New York. By refusing to shore up the losses in the Vatican Bank shell companies, the Pope is remiss. The payments of the loan should have been made from the bank because they had been charging 15 to 20% money laundering fees for years on end now, and they had billions and billions of dollars. But now you've got the bank on the rocks, you've got these shell companies on the rocks, and there's a massive investigation going on by the Bank of Italy and their finance officers into Calvi, the Ambrosiano Bank, and they're revealing that hundreds of millions of dollars has been illegally exported out of Italy to the Vatican in all of their strangely named companies, all of the shell companies we went over last time. So Ambrosiano, the bank, had loaned $1.5 billion to those shell companies. And we know from last time that they were being used to buy up parts of that bank. Money laundering. The probe, thanks to John Paul II's inaction, began to increase the scrutiny, and it would lead to an office called Steinbaum International. This company was located on the property of the Ambrosiano Bank, and it basically was a drugs for arms smuggling company, supposedly to make the world safe for democracy. The raid on Arezzo produced another devastating result: the loss of power for the Christian Democrats in Italy, who had been in charge since World War II. And the CIA had taken money from the drug trades, $65 million in cash to prop up the Christian Democrats in Italy, all under the auspices of them avoiding being a communist country. When all of the communist activities and the terror acts that were supposedly attributed to the communists were all made up. They were all part of Operation Gladio in order to terrorize the Italian citizens, in order to allow the CIA to fake their elections, fake their presidents, and basically run a drug operation out of the country of Italy using the mafia and the P2 Masons. So you have all of these people implicated. The P2 is now out again. This is like the third time it's been exposed and nothing's been done about it. The heads of Italy's military intelligence, the commanders of the financial police, journalists, editors, publishers, politicians are all on the list. Judges are on the list. So the CIA realized that they could not weather this crisis and would collapse within a year. The government would. So they could not afford to lose control of the financial police, because that would expose the money laundering. The military intelligence would not be able to plant evidence of the communist acts, and the journalists wouldn't be able to do their Mockingbird operation and tell lies in the daily newspaper. So they were panicking. At the bidding of the elite members of the Trilateral Commission, had engineered the Pope's election, which we learned about last time, and basically catered to his every demand. And most of those demands had to do with Lex Walesa in the Solidarity in Poland. They had shelled out $200 million to Solidarity by this point. So the Pope's sudden decision to start talking to the Soviet Union and work out a compromise for Poland sent them into a massive panic. Because if you're going to be blaming the Soviets for being the evil empire, you can't have the Pope talking to them. So that just screwed up everything. To include Reagan. Reagan was totally pissed off about this, because he's selling the Soviet Union being the bad guys and spending us into debt to the tune of trillions of dollars for Star Wars and all this other satellite space weaponry, all under the auspices that the Soviets are the bad guys. Well, if the Soviets are willing to work out a deal with the Pope, that kind of flies in the face of all of these one world order guys. So they're totally pissed off at the Pope at this point. Everybody's pissed off at him. So John Paul II meets with Lech Walesa and a Solidarity delegation, and basically tells them that they don't have anything to worry about the Soviet invading Poland. They're not going to do that, that he has worked with the Soviet Union before, and but the workers want to strike against the Soviet Union. So all of the Solidarity people realized that John Paul II had been arranging talks with the Kremlin about a political deal between the Soviet leaders and the Union organizers. He felt uniquely qualified to do this because while he was the Archbishop in Krakow, Poland, he had dealt with communist leaders, and he felt, the book says, godless Soviets and devout Catholics could live together under the same roof. The vast majority of the Poles espoused Marxist doctrine during the week and trooped off to Mass every Sunday. So it really wasn't that big of a deal. And he called it a particular brand of Christian humanism. That's interesting. So now everybody's in a total panic. So the Holy Father was negotiating with the Kremlin about other matters as well, including an arrangement for nuclear disarmament and recognition of the PLO. Now, you can imagine the panic that that would cause. Because keep in mind, just as we found out about all of um, the appearances of all this conflict. So, if you could actually arrange a peace deal with the PLO, that would give Israel and Mossad no reason to be on this armament um, track as well. You have to have an enemy. So any peace deals are out. If you start talking about peace, you're dead. And because that just flies in the face of everything that the international syndicate wants. So by March of 1981, Solidarity had mounted the largest strike in the history of the Soviet Union. They believed a report from the French diplomat that the Pope would leave Vatican City to stand with the people on the picket line. But at the last minute, Lech Walesa receives a letter from John Paul II, who condemned the union's intransigent positions and asked for the strikers to return to work. The effect of this communication was immediate, and the general strike was called off. So I want to just harken back 1 second to what we were talking about the last time about Argentina. And you remember what we were talking about the current Pope and his role in the crimes against humanity charges for his not speaking out against the murders and the flying of drugged and dead bodies over the ocean and dropping them off out of an airplane in Argentina. And because he was the Archbishop, Pope Francis was the Archbishop in Argentina when those things were happening, had he spoke out one time and said that this was wrong, there is a strong possibility in a 85% Catholic country like Argentina is, I don't know what it is today, but it was then, that would have had a very significant effect on the legitimacy of the dictator that was mass murdering everybody in Argentina. But he never said a word. And we know from when we reviewed that chapter that he actually was turning in Catholic priests that expressed different doctrine than what he had sanctioned within Argentina, and they were tortured. Some of them languished in prison for up to 6 months or more, and he never spoke out about it. So the Pope's timing could not have been worse for Gladio. In Belgium, there were plans for a massacre to happen there, which actually resulted in the killing of 8 people, to include an entire family. Sounds like Barack Obama. The same unit was training for an attack on a police station. There were stealing weapons in order to plant them on communist agitators. In Spain, there were gladiator units that were hunting down and assassinating leading members of the Basque separatist movement. In France, you had plans going on to murder a police inspector and his entire family, which they did. Germany, there were operations going on at the current time for a major terror attack in Munich, and the weapons used in that attack came from this large dump that also had weapons tracked to other Italian operations, and they had just completed the bombing in Bologna in Italy. So there was a massive amount of terror attacks going on as a part of Operation Gladio at the time to destabilize Europe and the people there. So backtracking just a little bit, in 1980, there was a general in Turkey by the name of Kenan Evren. He was the commander of the counter-guerrillas Gladio unit they had staged a coup that toppled the government of Ecevit, who was a democratically elected Democrat left party. Upon hearing the news, President Carter phoned the CIA station chief in Ankara and said, "Your people have made the coup," quote, "your people have made the coup," unquote. And his response, Henze's response was, "Yes, our boys have done it." So no one's surprised. As a matter of fact, his national security advisor, Brzezinski, says for Turkey, a military government would be the best solution. So you have the people in DC telling all of the rest of the world what kind of governments they're allowed to have and which ones they're not allowed to have. So they're better under a military government in Turkey. Evren dissolved the Turkey parliament, suspended legislations governing the civil liberties and human rights of Turkish citizens. There were thousands of people that were executed. The coup was successful due to the intensive training of the Gladio units and their younger youth division called the Grey Wolves, after the original werewolf units from Germany. Select officers were even trained at Fort Benning, Georgia, and a Ensenada naval base in California. So throughout the 70s, the counter-guerrilla and Grey Wolves were responsible for all kinds of terror attacks all over Turkey. The CIA unleashed them to fight the PKK, which in this book, they say that the PKK are the Kurdish Workers' Party formed in 1979, and that they sought a Leninist Marxist state. That's just not true. I spent 6 months in northern Iraq. The leader of the Kurds at the time, we had dinner with him probably once a week. The PKK is the militant element of the Kurdish people. They fought against Turkey because Turkey, with their gladiator units, now that I know that, Gladio units, at the time I was there, I'd never even heard of these. They would launch terror attacks against the Kurdish people. As a matter of fact, I'm not even convinced that what happened to the Kurdish people actually happened to them by Saddam Hussein. The Turkish government, because we talked about this a little bit before, but just as a hash, the lines that were drawn after World War II were drawn on purpose to cut through culturally ethnic people to create a strategy of tensions. So you have the Kurdish people, and you could have very easily drawn a line around where they're at and say, this is Kurdistan. They did not do that. What they did was they cut off part of them in Syria, they cut off part of them in Iraq, they cut off part of them in Turkey, and part of them in Iran, knowing that exactly what had happened was going to happen. They're going to be fighting till kingdom come, and they will be always the customer of the military industrial complex. Plus, you also have all of the exact same poppy fields all over that area. So now we've got built-in drug trade, we've got built-in customers for the military industrial complex, all because, and it was all done on purpose. And then you embed after World War II these Gladio units to stoke the hatred, to build the customers. Once you realize, it just blows your mind that these people are that evil. So anyway, I disagree with the author where he says that they were Marxist-Leninists. They're not. Like I said, I got to know some of them. As a matter of fact, one of the guys that lived over in the Iranian portion of what should have been Kurdistan, I got to know pretty well. He actually asked me to go on a gambling trip with him once my deployment was over. I didn't get to know him that well, but he did invite me. but they all speak fluent English. They were very interesting people to talk to. And I was the only female up there besides the Red Cross representative, which now that I think of it was really weird. Huh. Red Cross. Okay. Anyway, moving on. So the deployed against the Armenian. So the wolves were deployed against the Armenian secret army for the liberation of Armenia, a group dedicated to putting an end to NATO imperialism. So, of course, if in Armenia, and they're having genocide there too, if you had a guy or a group that were against the imperialism of NATO, they are immediately the enemy of these Gladio units, right? Because they're all out of the NATO area of these international syndicates. So, trained in the Beirut camps of the PLO, this resistance group was, they were responsible for the assassination of 36 Turkish diplomats, trying to keep them out of their business. Both groups represented an obstruction to the Gladio creation of the New World Order. So if you're this resistance group, they're coming after you. You're not allowed to be in your own country. You're not allowed to be a president duly elected if you resist this one world order agenda. The key to gaining control of Northern Eurasia, according to Brzezinski and other members of the Trilateral Commission, remained Turkey. And we talked about that last time. Turkey is the linchpin. And that's why they're in NATO. That's the only reason. I scratched my head for years on how Turkey got into NATO. Turkey is in NATO to control all of their former Ottoman Empire entities, because those people look up to Turkey and as fierce fighters and kind of still a quasi caliphate leader of the Muslim world. So the Central Asian republics, Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan all share a common Kurdic Turkish heritage and common Islamic faith. Even though they were part of the Soviet, at this time in the 80s, they were part of the Soviet Union, they still had a pan-Turkish banner. And you remember what I told you last time, the GCC had all of the same talking points that the pan-Europe, led by Germany, talking points of the Madrid Circular. So they're all in the one world government agenda. So let's see. You got that right. Same as Yugoslavia. You're absolutely right. You are absolutely right. As a matter of fact, I read a crossover today, and we might get to it a little later, about Bulgaria. Very true. So the pan-Turkish banner was unfurled by the Grey Wolves. They are the ones that were given the mission to create the pan-Turkish entity of all of the former Soviet Union satellites. The Wolves became the favored lapdogs of the bureaucrats in Langley's CIA, and untold billions were spent on the pack. In 1978, Dojan Oz, I really would love to know if that's any relation to Dr. Oz, who is from Turkey as well, a public prosecutor in Ankara, uncovered the existence of these units and issued the following report to the president. There is such an organization. It includes people from the security forces, such as the Army and Secret Services, during the First and Second National Front governments in particular. They largely adopted the state mechanisms to their own purposes. Their ultimate aim is to introduce a fascist system in Turkey with all of the associated organs. Oz was immediately gunned down and killed in front of his house. There were several witnesses, and the leader of one of the wolf packs was arrested and sentenced to death. The military Supreme Court immediately overturned the verdict and set him free. A similar scenario took place several years later when another one of them was arrested for participating in the murder of Oz. He too was tried and convicted and sentenced to execution 7 times. And every single time he was released. They are everywhere. You want to know why our judicial system doesn't work? They're everywhere. The CIA's financial support for the wolves were also necessitated by a need to protect the Balkan route and the flow of the heroin from the Afghan and Iran, the Golden Triangle up there, said to be worth $3 million an hour. They also safeguarded the smuggling of weapons into the countries. The illegal arms that were confiscated in Turkey between 80 and 84 was 638,000 revolvers, 4,000 submachine guns, 48,000 rifles, 7,000 machine guns, 26 rocket launchers, and 1 mortar. These are the same people that are telling you they're all about gun control. They are about gun control because they want to control all of the guns. The wolves were so integral to the drugs for arms enterprise that it was almost impossible to make a clear-cut distinction between a Gladio unit, a Turkish mafia member, and a Turkey's intelligence operation, which they called the unofficial arm of the CIA. So they have a guy that is part of this operation who has a really crazy name, Ergenekon, which it's named after a mythical place, like on a high plain. They refer to this as the bastard son of Gladio, like kind of almost like a follow-on name of the Operation Gladio, because once the name gets being used and is now being accused of ill-gotten gains, they'll just come up with a different name, because they're leftists. So you've got this entity, which is basically Gladio, and they could arrange the escapes of anybody that was jailed, arrested. They created false identities. They arranged for money laundering operations, and they were part of the control of the heroin trade in the Golden Triangle, which at the time produced 20% of Turkey's earned income. So throughout the 70s, you had several people that were CIA operatives in Turkey, allegedly to nurture the wolf packs. And one of the Turkish guys is named Abdullah Kaf, and Mehmet Ali Agca. So we're going to call him Agca and Kaf. Kaf, who became the vice chairman of the Wolves for the entire country, was also an assassin and was involved in several high-profile assassinations. Agca began his criminal career as a drug smuggler on the Balkan route. He eventually became a bodyguard and a hitman, working with Kaf and a guy by the name of Selig. So just as an aside, talking about one of the CIA guys that were over there helping facilitate all of this, his name is Dwayne Dewey Claridge. So I also have him here. Let's see. Add to stage. We can get him up. Here he is. So Claridge defended the overthrow, and I know this isn't directly related to this one, but I just want to give you a taste of what kind of guy this is. Claridge defended the overthrow of a democratically elected government in Chile, and And you remember that guy murdered thousands of people too. We'll interfere whenever we decide it's in our national security interest to intervene. This is a quote. Get used to it, world. We're not going to put up with nonsense. He admitted to the House Intelligence Committee staff in a secret briefing in 1984 that the Contras were routinely murdering civilians and Sandinista officials in the provinces, as well as heads of cooperatives, nurses, doctors, and judges. Sounds just like Turkey, because it's Gladio. But he claims that this did not violate President Reagan's executive order prohibiting assassinations because the agency defined it as just killing. So if you just kill somebody, that's different than assassinating them. After all, this is war. This is his quote. After all, this is war, a paramilitary operation, he said. So this is the guy that's over in Turkey and you see right here, under his, look at this, the Turkish Stay Behind Anti-Communist Organization. Nowhere in there does they say Operation Gladio. Stay Behind Operations is Operation Gladio. Just so y'all know. Every time you see that, you think Operation Gladio. Isn't that crazy? Totally crazy. All right. So, back to the book. We only sent our best and brightest over there to Turkey. In 1979, Agca, one of the Grey Wolves, took part in the murder of Ipepsi, the editor-in-chief of a Turkey leading daily newspaper. When taken into custody, Agca quickly confessed, yes, I shot him and I killed him. I was alone. I fired 4 or 5 times. The only problem was there were 13 spent cartridges at the crime scene. So he, at the time, the Ipepsi guy was one of the most distinguished journalists. His assassination shocked the nation. Agca received a life sentence and was incarcerated in the Istanbul prison. After serving 6 months, he, quote unquote, escaped wearing an army uniform. There was, in fact, no flight. He simply strolled out of the jail. And Abdullah Cap, his buddy, was his escort. Because they own everybody. 3 days after his escape, Agca wrote a letter which made it clear that he was the perfect choice for a hit on the Holy Father. He wrote, this is his letter, fearing that Turkey is attempting to realize a new political, military, and economic power with an Islamic brother country in the Middle East during this highly sensitive time, the Western imperialists are sending John Paul, who behind his religious mask is a commander of the cross, with all speed to Turkey. If this senseless and poorly timed visit is not canceled, then I will not hesitate to shoot the Pope. This is the only reason I escaped from prison. Revenge will be certainly taken for an attack on Mecca by the U.S. and Israel. Agca was not only an experienced assassin, he was also a pan-Turkey visionary. He was also delusional and at sometimes called himself Jesus Christ. Early in April 1981, there was a word received from Gladio that it just literally kill the Pope and blame the communists. That was a Gladio directive. It was to be the ultimate false flag attack. The message came with a payment of $1.7 million. The arrangement had been made by members of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, P2, and the Savari Club, which was a covert organization that had been established by Henry Kissinger. I also noticed that Savari Club, you know how we noticed that all of the emblems and everything of the software programs all come as part of this whole, so Safari is the Apple internet, and Safari Club is another one of their secret organizations established by Henry Kissinger, and it's just like the Round Table in the UK, the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, which all of these people belong to. They meet twice a year. These are just excuses for them to get together and plan this shit. So the operation's now been declared April 1981, and the gunmen are going to be Kath and Adka. So into the story comes a guy by the name of Ted Shackley, Theodore Shackley. He is one of the CIA's most infamous agents. They call him the Blonde Ghost. He helped set up the heroin trade in Southeast Asia during Vietnam. He oversaw Operation Phoenix, killing 40,000 non-combatant Vietnamese, which we've all talked about already. He also served as a principal figure in the Nguyen Han Bank, which we know Nguyen got suicided and Han went missing, which was a money laundering Australia bank, overseeing the deposit of billions of black funds into the Australian money laundromat. From Australia, he went to South America, where he took an active part in Operation Condor, which we know is a follow-on Operation Gladio, specifically for South America, by organizing death squads. In Chile, he teamed up with one of the guys to murder the duly elected president of Chile, Allende. In 1976, Shackley became the CIA's deputy director for operations. So he's now in charge of covert operations all over the world. So he sets up corporations, subsidiaries to conceal all of the shell companies that are needed, the money laundering operations. He's the go-to guy now. So his people were the ones that were supplying the weaponry to Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, Saddam Hussein in Iraq. Many of these shell companies were set up in Switzerland. Some of them include a company called Lake Resources, Inc., the Stanford's in every story, Technology Trading Group, Inc., and another one, Champagne de Services Fiduciary. Others such as CSF Investments Limited and Udall Research Corporation were located in South America. A few were established in the U.S. called Orca in Florida, Consultants International in Washington, D.C., all funded with heroin proceeds. And a few, including the U.S. firms, were also linked to the Vatican money laundering. So after leaving the CIA in 1979, Shackley formed Research Associates International, which specialized in providing intelligence to businesses, because we know most of the business leaders are CIA assets as well. Since intelligence consisted of some of the intelligence consisted of classified files he walked out of the CIA with. In 1980, his talents were sought by the Reagan-Bush Election Committee, and he was intricately involved in the October surprise, which basically was the agreement that they were going to extend the incarceration of the hostages in the Iran embassy until after Reagan got elected, so he could look like the hero and be sure that he defeated Jimmy Carter. So Shackley was involved with that too, because they're just people. Whether they stay incarcerated in Iran for a little bit longer, it's no big deal. So Shackley was also a member of Kissinger's Safari Club, and the organization included heads of intelligence agencies all over the U.S., France, Egypt, Iran, Morocco, Saudi Arabia, and a host of CIA agents and former agents, because you're not ever not a CIA agent once you were. The primary function of the club was to orchestrate terrorists and proto-terrorists by proxy groups throughout the world. They just never stop. So one of the chief executives of the French Secret Service served as the leader of Safari. And he served along with CIA Director William Casey, Secretary of State Alexander Haig, Treasury Secretary William Simon, U.S. Ambassador to the Vatican William Wilson, Gelly, the P2 guy that's in charge of the most worshipful master, or whatever you call him, Friar Felix Morlian, and General Santo Vito, who was in charge of Italy's intelligence agency. So, through the Sovereign Knights of Malta, these people all became aware of John Paul II's negotiation with the Kremlin, and as I said earlier, totally pissed off about it. So Shackley arrives in Rome February 3rd, 1981, for a series of meetings with General Santo Vito. The assassination, in keeping with the strategy of tension, would be blamed on the Soviets. So you've got a multitude of CIA associates, including journalist Claire Sterling, Paul Hinsey, the station chief in Ankara, Michael Ledeen, a consultant to the U.S. National Security Council, the Friar Felix Morlian of the right-wing pro-Deo movement, Francesco Pazienza, a CIA informant, and also an Italian intelligence official who helped engineer the one of the bombings in Italy, and then another agent that had worked with the Grey Wolf. So Santo Vito emerges as the lead character in the assassination plot, and he's a general in Italy. He would handle all aspects of the investigation afterwards. That was his job. So he's the one arranging it, and he's going to be the one doing the investigation of the assassination. You gotta love these people. So he would grant shelter to the assassins as head of the military intelligence and commander of the Italian Gladio units. He was uniquely qualified for this role. The general was working closely with Steuben, which is the company that's the arms trafficker that's located at the bank that's in bed with the Vatican Bank. So he's ensuring the safety of massive arms for drugs operations with the Sicilian Mafia, the Turkish Mafia, and the CIA. So he definitely was positioned perfectly for this operation. He was also in charge of implementing the strategy of tensions throughout Italy. He was serving the CIA by commissioning the underworld figures to conduct hits on troublesome politicians, magistrates, and journalists. What a nice guy. No man knew more about Gladio than Santo Vito. In Rome, Shackley and Santo Vito worked with the Italian military intelligence, the church, in developing a thing called the Bulgarian thesis. So they're going to blame Bulgaria. In other words, the Soviets. So Sergio Ivanov Antonov, who was a Bulgarian communist that worked in Rome for the Balkan Airlines, he's going to be the patsy. So they're going to set him up as the guy who did the hit on Pope John Paul II. As soon as the investigation of the Holy Homicide got underway, a team of CIA spin doctors, including Claire Sterling, Michael Ledeen, and Paul Hinsey, would circulate the thesis and manufacture connections between Antonov and the Kremlin. So he even had a Russian sounding name, which I'm sure is why he was picked. So the only problem was he had nothing to do with it. So Hinsey, who possessed a literary flair, served as a CIA station chief in Ankara. For this reason, he could be counted on to manufacture the inside information from supposedly Bulgaria on Antonov. And they also had close ties. This guy had close ties to NBC, so they would be sure that all of their pieces would be broadcast worldwide. So March of 1981, there's a warning that's passed to Vatican security about the planned attack, but the Pope just kind of laughs it off because he's talking to the Russians every day, or routinely, so he knows they're not going to try to knock him off. They have a great relationship. So he kind of just like, whatever. So the Adka, the assassin from Turkey, makes his way to a hotel in Sofia, Hungary, where he meets his partner, Selek, and they're going to make arrangements for safe passage, the passports, and new identities. Then they move forward to Munich, and in 1981, West Germany was home to 50,000 werewolves who acted as stormtroopers for Germany's Federal Intelligence Service. And Germany's Federal Intelligence Service is the ones who created the werewolf units. And again, I'm just going to take a minute to note this author says that it had been, talking about Gladio, it had been set up by the CIA under former Nazi General Galen, who became a member of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta in 1956. That's not true. Galen, it was not set up by the CIA under Galen. Galen set it up in 1942 before we ever even won the war. There wasn't even a CIA. It was OSS. So Galen sets up the Gladio units, called the werewolves, and he makes a deal with Alan Dulles to hand them off as long as Galen gets to keep his old job. So the author is absolutely not correct in that particular area. The complicity of the German intel entity in the assassination attempt on John Paul II has been widely ignored by the U.S. press, like just about everything with Gladio. Even though Kath later testified to a judge in Rome that he had received 3 million marks from the German Secret Service to perform the hit. So you have the German intel, part of NATO, arranging to kill the Pope. Selek was a subject of a red bulletin from Turkey Interpol for a string of murders, including the execution of a teacher in Turkey. And so you've got these people, they're going from country to country to country. There's all kinds of, they're federal prisoners. The one guy escaped convict. And they're just moving around like nobody's business. So they all meet. Adka, Kath, and Selek travel to Milan. They meet with the Salent guy at Steuben, who is the arms company on the grounds of Ambrosiano, the bank that's tied into the Vatican. They stay at a nearby hotel. They use fake names, and they're learning the layout of the Pope's apartments, how to get around the Vatican. On April 23rd, John Paul II was holding a private audience with CIA Director William Casey. The Turks were provided with 9mm Browning high-power semi-automatic pistols and 13-round cartridge clips. They received training from the CIA, and they were given weapons from Germany. So on May 13th, John Paul II appeared in his Pope Mobile, and At 5:19 in the afternoon, a series of shots rang out. He's hit. He does not die. And it is probably a miracle that he did survive because the bullets passed right by major arteries. So immediately, a Dutch coach driver said that the Pope had been shot by Agca and two other gunmen. Onlookers were providing the same testimony. Some mentioned a diversionary explosion off in the corner of the square. The arrest warrant was immediately signed and stated that Agca had acted in collaboration with a couple of other people whose identities were not known. The magistrate who had been assigned to the investigation concluded there are documented proof that Mehmed Agca did not act alone. The proof in part consisted of a variety of casings found in the vicinity. Such evidence did not appear in court, and neither did the investigating magistrate. He was quickly removed because he wasn't playing along. The trial lasted only 3 days. Agca rejected the jurisdiction of the Italian court, claiming the incident occurred in the Vatican City, a sovereign state, and he demanded a change of venue. It was rejected. He said he wasn't going to answer any questions. During the trial, a Franciscan nun from Genoa identified Agca as the would-be killer and stated her belief that he acted alone. But the nun's testimony was undermined by a a photograph that had been taken by an American tourist. The photo showed a man running away from the scene with a pistol in his hand, which was not Agca. The court ruled that there existed no valid elements permitting to confirm or exclude the possibility of other gunmen. The sighting of two unlikely figures at the scene of the crime, former CIA agent Ted Shackley and Tom Clines. The presence of these CIA agents the same day at St. Peter's Square at that particular time has never been explained. And there was a book written about Shackley by David Korn, who we all know is a joke, and not one mention in his biography that he was there when John Paul II was attempted to be assassinated. Agca was sentenced to life in prison with 1 year of solitary confinement. Despite the sentence, the prisoner soon received an ongoing stream of surprising visitors. So you've got the whole lineup of P2, who's who. I won't go through all of their names, but basically all of them comes to his cell. They're basically showing him photographs of this Antonov guy they're going to accuse of being associated with the Bulgarians/Soviets. And so supposedly he's memorizing all of the guy's facial features, all of his aspects, and they're telling him all of this stuff to say. So in the fall of 1981, Agca was singing a new song to Italian prosecutors. Instead of saying that he acted alone, he's now saying that he acted in service to the KGB. The assassination team had included an accountant and a military attaché from the Bulgarian embassy in Rome, and the plans were drafted in the Roman apartment of Antonov. The problem was that the description that these people had given Agca of Antonov's apartment was the apartment below him occupied by one of them, and it didn't look at all like Antonov's apartment at all. And so immediately the story starts unraveling, and they tried to get Agca to tell him how tall this guy was, which, because he's never seen him, he had no idea, and that was one of the pieces of information they left out. But in the meantime, the Italian police arrest this guy, thinking he's part of the KGB. They drug him. They totally disoriented him, insisted he was part of the assassination, kept him in prison for 3 years. 3 years. And he was never able afterwards. He's completely physically disabled when he got out. He was never able to even have a conversation or perform a simple task after those 3 years. Another one. And he later, in 2007, is found dead in his apartment, which basically had nothing in it. They destroyed the man, in other words. And they don't care. At the start of 1982, the disinformation campaign was in full swing of the KGB's supposed involvement. Marvin Cow presented special reports on the Soviet connection to the sacrilege as if it was facts. You've got the New York Times writing articles about it, and you have and I'm not making this up, authors who were employed by the CIA writing books, The Plot to Kill the Pope, and all of it lies. This is what they do, Mockingbird Media. So, despite the discrepancies, the Bulgarian thesis might have remained credible, save for the work of, and as soon as I start reading this, y'all, we've been through enough chapters together now. As soon as you start reading about a investigative journalist actually doing journalism, this guy's name's Ugur, Ugur, Mumcu, Mumcu, one of Turkey's leading journalists. Digging into Agca's background, he uncovered the fact that the would-be assassin was a lackey for Selenk. He discovered that Selenk was involved in smuggling arms and drugs in cargo ships that sailed under the Panamanian flag. He interviewed crew members. He obtained testimony about the ships carrying 495 rocket launchers, 10,000 missiles from the Bulgarian port of Brukos to Istanbul, where it had been received by leading figures in the Turkish underworld world. Now, this Bulgaria link here is very important. I'm going to tell you why in a second. He discovered that he had ties to the Grey Wolves. He realized that the would-be assassin performed executions, and that he also identified Selik as the gunman who had been running in the St. Peter's Square with the pistol. So now this journalist has done amazing work. The Turkish journalist made more discoveries, including the ties of Adka to the Grey Wolves, to Stimba International, that drug or the arms smuggling company on the bank's property, and the ties to the CIA. So you know he's dead man walking right now. He pinpointed Henry Arson as a key figure in the massive smuggling operations. And he also established that Antonov, the guy who they totally destroyed, was neither an agent nor a double agent. He was simply a dupe. So the reporter would pay for making these revolutions. He was killed when a car bomb exploded outside his home, January 1993. No arrests were made. He launched his probe into the attack on John Paul II. Paul Hinsey tried to convince him that the would-be assassins were agents of the Soviet Union. The reporter refused to follow this information that was doled out by the CIA station chief in Turkey, opting instead for a real investigation. And Hinsey told him, this CIA bastard told him, if you do not, you might find a nice surprise in store. So my last piece is this piece right here. If you look, I put this link in the notes. The Bulgarian connection leads to Western terror networks. This article is amazing. I posted it on Truth Social. And what I want you to understand from this, at the time, Bulgaria was part of the Soviet Union. So there is absolutely, when you go back to Anthony Sutton's books about the Soviet Union being set up by the same people that set up the fascist and all of these gladiator units, there's no difference. if you look at the tie-in of supposedly the Bulgarians, again, Soviets, working with the P2, it talks about P2 in this article. It goes through the entire lineup. It's simply amazing. There's so much of the stuff out here when you start looking and you know where to look and you know what words to look for. So let me go back here. Does anybody have any questions? No questions? Okay. That's going to do us for tonight. We'll pick up next time on chapter 17. I appreciate everybody being here. And thanks for sticking around.